Hello, everyone. I'm Alex Shu, an adjunct assistant professor at the Keough School for Global Affairs, affiliated with the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. And I today am engaged with Dr. Jason Klocek, research fellow at the Center for the Study of Religion and Society at the University of Notre Dame, my former hallmate before the Plague Age, and senior researcher at the U.S. Institute of Peace, or USIP. Jason, welcome.
Thanks, Alex. Great to be with you. Great to see you again.
It's really great to do one of these with you in a more formal setting. Jason, I like to start these things out by asking people where they're from.
So I am from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was actually just back there over Labor Day weekend. I grew up there in Western Pennsylvania.
And how does a Western Pennsylvanian get interested in studying religion and conflict as you do?
Yeah, that's. I think there's a short answer and a long answer to that. The short answer is vocation, and the long answer is, well, how do you understand vocation and how do you determine vocation? And it took a long time. It was a lot of starts and stops, maybe some ostensible missteps that have actually helped along the way. But really, my path has run through Notre Dame in a number of ways. When I left Western Pennsylvania, I came to the University of Notre Dame for my undergraduate degree, and then from there left for some 15 years or so, and have circled back, which I'm very grateful for. Along the way, I found myself just always drawn to points of tension, I guess, and religious communities on the periphery. And so I often think of Otto's comment, Rudolf Otto's comment, the comparative religionist and Lutheran theologian, about the holy or the sacred being something that fascinates and terrifies us, or attracts and repels us. And that's why I like to mention this sort of idea of vocation in terms of studying religion and conflict and religion and politics more broadly. Because it was something that I was always drawn to, but also tried to run from a little bit. When I was at Notre Dame, I was obviously drawn. I was actually drawn here not for the football program, but it was a campus visit where I visited the grotto and the basilica and some of those spots around campus that really stuck with me. And then after I graduated, I went to Turkmenistan, post-Soviet country, which you would have thought would be like the furthest place you could get from religion in that sense, after all these decades of Soviet ideology and control. Exactly. But what I ended up finding there was I kept finding, these little points in these peripheral communities of interest that I was drawn to. So one of those was the Apostolic Nunciature, which was in Ashgabat. So it's the representative from the Vatican, and Catholicism was not permitted. There was not, they didn't have permission at the time to have a Catholic church there. So this was, they had diplomatic status and a small chapel within that nunciature. And I ended up striking up a friendship with the two priests that were there, and would often go once a month or every couple of months for lunch and started to worship with that community. At the same time, I found myself in the town that I lived in, talking with a Shia community that had another worship space that it wasn't legally allowed to have. So it was sort of a house mosque in this sense. And then interacting with the Russian Orthodox community as well, which though was officially allowed to operate, was still constrained in certain ways. And I still remember an evening baptism that I attended, which was in an actual river, the Murgab River in southeastern Turkmenistan. So anyways, there's sort of ways that I tried to move away, found myself coming back. And after Turkmenistan, I spent some time on the island of Crete at a synagogue there called Etz Chaim Synagogue, which is another very interesting sort of community in the periphery. It was, for a long time, a Jewish community of one or two. The person who renovated it, it was Nikos Stavroulakis, a longtime historian and educator in the Mediterranean. He had also advised on the construction of the Jewish Museum in Athens. But his father was from Crete. He retired to his hometown there in Chania, and through a World Monuments Fund, restored what was a synagogue there in the town. And so I ended up participating in that community, serving as a docent, living with the community, and so forth. And then from there, it was kind of all downhill because it was religion and politics, religion and conflict. So all those communities I was engaged with were also in tension with the broader society around them. I think Turkmenistan's kind of obvious, but even that synagogue in Crete, when it was being restored, the local religious leader, the metropolitan of the town, said that the Jewish community was allowed to have a museum, but not a place of worship. And even after they worked through that tension, there have been other points of tension in the community, including some arsonist attacks in the 2000s. And so it just all led me back over and over to this question of not just how does religion draw us in and shape our behavior, but also how do other communities, particularly communities that are either of different religions or of no religion, perceive those communities. And that's what a lot of my work centers on. So I came back to the US, I did a master's at Georgetown, and then my PhD at Berkeley.
Let's go back to Turkmenistan a little bit, because I need
Sure.
a little bit more Central Asian context, I suppose. Yeah. And the way you portrayed it seemed very peaceful. Like all these different religious communities arguably were for peace. And you brought up Rudolf Otto, religion as this sort of fascinating thing, this intrinsically engaging thing. That's what drew you to these spaces, to these communities. It seems like there's a lot of potential there for peace. Where did you see the sort of fissures, either historical or incipient, or potential in the future, in first Turkmenistan, and then we can do Crete next?
Yeah, and also just the broader Central Asian context, which is fascinating, again, as these sort of crossroads between, the East and the West, and a lot of, with the Silk Road, a lot of movement through there. And I should mention, one of the more interesting trips I took when I was there was into Uzbekistan. And there's a small Jewish community there in Bukhara, which at the time was talking about sort of becoming extinct, or at least emigrating out, so there'd be no physical presence left there. But since then, that community has been a bit more robust over the last decade or so. But part of your question requires us to think about what we mean by peace. And so in some way, what's happening in Central Asia, particularly when I was there, which would be the early 2000s, was a sort of what we would call, as conflict scholars, a negative peace, so the absence of violence, and religious actors and communities being very aware of the political system and sensitive to it. And so for example, the Catholic, so one issue could be, and we see this a lot, and we can talk about this at other points of our conversation about religious freedom, but the issue of proselytization, right? And so the Catholic community, for example, was very aware that they had to not be seen as particularly trying to proselytize towards Muslims within the country. It's a Muslim majority country, and Central Asia is a Muslim majority region, predominantly Sunni majority. And so the nuncio who was there, Father Andrzej, he also understood there was a long history of Polish residents in the capital in particular, from the population transfers during the Soviet period. And so they predominantly reached out to people of Polish descent, and that's predominantly who was there. Same thing with the Shia community in the town that I lived. It was predominantly people of Iranian descent, Persian descent, and they weren't actively proselytizing, and they knew how to operate, in other words, under the radar. And so there was a sense of religious peace in that the government, while monitoring these groups, was okay with them doing what they were doing, as long as they didn't step outside those boundaries. The Orthodox community sometimes there were a few other problems because they were baptizing, but again, they were focusing on people of Russian descent or Slavic descent in that sense. It's become more controversial over time because Turkmenistan has also fused nationalism with religion. Even when I was there, the president, who was Turkmenbashi, had written the Ruknama, this what he called the spiritual book of the Turkmen people. And it's the only country I know where minarets they don't have Quranic verses. They have verses from the Ruknama inscribed on them. And so this became then a bigger tension where ethnicity overlapped with a Muslim identity, but a particular type of Muslim identity. And so it's interesting, I guess, that in Turkmenistan you haven't seen fault lines develop further. But again, I think a reason for that is most minorities are leaving the country. I worked at what they called a mixed ethnic school. So it wasn't a Turkmen school. It was where pretty much everyone else went. There were some Turkmen, but people of Russian, Polish, Azerbaijani, Armenian, Iranian, Afghani descent, so people. But every year, 2 or 3 families had left, either to go to Russia or somewhere else. And so in some way, they've dealt with religious differences in Central Asia by removing, or at least incentivizing, the removal of those differences. So that's one way to think about it. So that's what's happening in Central Asia a little bit, yeah.
So the minoritized populations were also minority ethnic and minority religious at the same time, and maybe
That's right.
had only come in over the last century or two, or longer history.
It depends on which group. So for, Turkmenistan borders Iran, and so there are ethnic Turkmen groups in northern Iran. You often hear about them in the news for religious repression there. And then there are families of Persian descent. So some of the families of Persian or Afghani descent, because the geography could have been there longer. Certainly, yes, some of the ethnic minorities that made up the broader Soviet empire would have been within the 20th century.
So let's move to Crete then. The majoritarian religion there is the Orthodox Church, or what?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So Greece is one of these interesting examples I often like to bring up when talking about religious freedom as well, because we think of democracies as being relatively religiously free, or at least if you want to compare countries, that democracies will have higher levels of religious freedom. And Greece is just a wonderful example of a democracy that has an official religion, the Greek Orthodox religion, that does make proselytization illegal, though it hasn't been prosecuted in years. It's technically still on the books, and there's a lot of societal tension, and though that has ebbed and flowed over the years, but particularly when it comes to Jewish communities. So the broader rise in anti-Semitism that we see across Europe, a number of those incidents are in Greece. And so that's sort of that's the context of recent, again, where you have a rather homogeneous population, both along ethnic and religious lines, and then small minority groups.
And what would be the small minority groups that you were working with in Crete?
So predominantly it would be the Jewish community, which was, again, at Chaim Synagogue. Now, it's an interesting community because Nikos had, understood. So the community was completely wiped out in World War II. It's really tragic. It was 230 or 40 so members of this particular synagogue. There actually used to be 2 synagogues in this town, which sort of points to, you can think about a more robust community there if you had 2 separate synagogues, and they were separated sort of along Jewish tradition. And so the synagogue that he renovated was a Sephardic community, so those Jews that had been exiled from Spain in the late 1400s. And but now the broader, because it's only an hour flight from Tel Aviv, Crete, what you had were a lot of people that were coming to worship there if they were traveling. Then some sort of fell in love with the spot because it's really a unique, beautiful space. It is one of those spaces that really draws you in. And so it became sort of this broader network of participants in the community. And that presented opportunities, but then also challenges. And so the challenge is there are very few people there to operate it, and it really continues to punch well above its weight in terms of the number of people involved in it and the resources it has. So it has created a number of initiatives in recent years to bring in Greek school children to learn about Jewish culture and Jewish religious practice. And that was something that I don't think would have happened 20 or 30 years ago. I know when I was there, families would wander down the street of this little back alley, and a number of Greek families would say, "It's the first time I've ever been in a synagogue. It's the first time I've ever, encountered a Jewish space." And so that's one. The other is, I just mentioned, a Catholic community. So, not surprisingly, minority communities work together when they're facing similar situations. And so there was also a Catholic community, not just at Chania, but in other parts of Greece. But here, for historical reasons and for similarity in tradition, there's less tension. So for example, Catholics in Greece will follow the Greek Orthodox liturgical calendar. I remember because I showed up for an Ash Wednesday Mass once, and a wonderful older nun, I said, "Oh, I'm here for the service," and she said, "Next week." And so some traditions are able to not assimilate, but fit into the majority culture for different reasons. Jews of Crete have always been sort of set apart for religious ritual, in terms of days of observing Sabbath and its rituals. And there are stories, though, of Crete, of wonderful stories, and I don't know how widely they apply, but of certain Cretan families that were Orthodox coming and turning lights on for Jewish communities if they needed them turned on a Friday, or baking bread and vice versa. But I'm not sure how broadly that applies. Yeah.
It's the religious pluralism. We find them all over the place, and I think we draw energy from them today, and at Ansari especially. I could ask you questions about Turkmenistan and Crete all day, but we have to move on. So you taught a course for Ansari last semester in the spring called Holy Crossroads on Global Religion and Politics, are your specialties. Would you like to say hello to your students, and what all did you learn?
Yeah, well, I'll say a big hello to the students. Though, it was a small class of 8 students here at Notre Dame and 8 students in Bangladesh, and I say more about how that came about. But we're still on a WhatsApp group and so forth, so I get to say hi to them often still.
The education continues.
Exactly.
Beyond and outside the classroom.
Yeah, we did a big hello when they all came back to campus a few weeks ago. And,
wow.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a fascinating, wonderful experience. I think it's it really embodies what Notre Dame undergraduate education is trying to accomplish in many ways. It came about because of many people at the university who all sort of think in the same way, suddenly coming together. And so the director of the Ansari Institute, Mahan Mirza, sort of talked to me about this and said, "We're thinking about doing this idea." And this was in November, but we didn't quite know how to form it. And then we had a wonderful partner in Oman, Jeff, who's at the Alamana Center. So the Alamana Center is who we partnered with and stayed with when we were in Oman. But he has a Notre Dame connection through the theologian David Burrell and in their time in Bangladesh. And then the Keough School really got on board and saw this as a great opportunity as well. Now, we would have never dreamed this could be the last time some of the students get to go abroad in their college education, because some of them were juniors and are now seniors. Yeah. And so for it became all the more, I think, important after the fact. Students have messaged over the summer, and we've continued to dialogue. Some continue to dialogue with Alamana Center over the summer. But the sort of the core of the course was to connect students that are here at Notre Dame with students at another great Holy Cross institution in Bangladesh, right? At Notre Dame University, Bangladesh. And as Mahan and I and others started talking about this, we realized this hadn't really been attempted yet. And that was a great opportunity and also a great challenge to sort of get this on board. But ultimately we had, like I said, it was roughly 8 and 8. There were a few more students at the university in Bangladesh that participated online. So we did a series of online discussions, and then 16 students in total met in Oman. So we were a little ahead of the curve, I guess, in terms of online instruction and Zoom classrooms.
Wow.
Yeah. And our aim was, to build dialogue between these students, to increase trust and allow them to engage in what really became heartfelt and challenging conversations that when we were in Oman involved crying during certain sessions. It was so intense. And to help on both sides sort of develop this broader global perspective where students, as well as teachers, can kind of reflect on how we see the world and how our positions lead us to focus on certain parts of a problem or an issue and to rethink our perspective and broaden it.
So in case viewers aren't familiar with the Holy Crossroads course, it's structured around a spring break, right, where students from Bangladesh and students at Notre Dame who had been in conversation with each other already got to meet physically in the Gulf state of Oman.
That's right. And it really worked well. And the idea was when we came back, we would continue that and in person, but then we all did it online because the university had sent students home. But yeah, and substantively, the idea of the course was, as you said, to talk about religion, global politics, really with the idea of, I had three main aims in the way I developed it. One was to help students push past this idea of religion and religious actors all being a unitary group. So to emphasize, I guess, in religious studies, the multivocality of religions. And this was particularly powerful on the Notre Dame side, because even one student came in saying, I never knew there were different perspectives in Islam, sort of was his takeaway towards the end. I thought it was all, the same. And here Oman really helped, because Oman, right, is neither Sunni nor Shia majority, but Abadi Islam. And so I think that gave a nice way of by introducing complexity actually helped in that sense. So yeah, to talk about the multivocality of religion, as a social scientist, I'm slightly obsessed about emphasizing religion shaping behavior, not just being a cause. So as social scientists, we often emphasize religion as the cause. Does it cause war? Does it cause peace? And I think a number of scholars at the moment are much more interested in talking about how it shapes behavior. Who fights in terms of conflict? Who fights? When do they fight? Where do they fight? What weapons do they use? Which groups do they target? And so that was the second part of the course. And the third was just to provide this comparative perspective. So as we talked about issues in Bangladesh or in Oman, how did that challenge us to rethink what was going on in our own community, both at Notre Dame and the United States? And so the beginning of the course was actually, it was fun for me because I learned more about Holy Cross. We went in 3 steps. We thought about the history of Notre Dame and its founding, and then religion and politics in the US, religion and politics in Bangladesh, and religion and politics in Oman. So we increasingly stepped out and tried to find these points of comparison, emphasizing that no one country or setting was the model. That the idea here was to think about how religion and politics were navigated in different ways, and the strengths and weaknesses, or the points of tension that arose and the points of cooperation that developed.
And again, I think this is part of your theme of trying not to isolate religion as an independent variable, but trying to see it as a realm of forces, as a whole sphere of activities. But was there, it seems like your class did not suggest that there was a final answer to how religion and politics should be laid out in any one place. That lots of different answers have been tried, lots of different answers are possible. Future answers have not been yet discovered, and that's what you sort of tasked your students in doing. Was there a sense that pluralism was part of the takeaway that you wanted to give besides multivocality?
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of questions. And so, and here it's that annoying and answer from a teacher or a scholar, which is it raised more questions than it did answers. But I think in this context, that's a really important point, because you can't expect to go into a course and cover 3 distinct contexts And then lots of thematic issues. We talked about how religion and conflict go together, religion and human rights, religion and democracy. So we thought about all of these relationships, and students came out. What I hoped was, again, sort of maybe rethinking the way they frame their questions, the questions they ask, and not always asking about religion as the cause here. Sometimes religion is actually a dependent variable. So we look sometimes about how politics shapes religious institutions, and the ebb and flow, I suppose, in Bangladesh of a secular constitution and then bringing religion back in, and a big tension there about how do you balance that. And then we talked about in the US, so one is sort of, what is religion doing, I guess, is sort of to build off of what you said. The other is to think about which perspectives you're drawing in, or what communities you're focusing on. So oftentimes if we think about religion and peace, we isolate a certain set of cases and sort of confirm that idea. And so I agree with you in this idea of pluralism, because pluralism necessarily also involves a certain tension as well, right? It's how do we dialogue within that tension? And I hope students left the course like that. They did write, and we'll put a little plug here, right? On the Ansari Institute website, there are a couple of blog reflections from the students, and I think they're saying it much better than I am, in that they rethought religious freedom. One student wrote about, so what does religious freedom in the US mean? And she sort of rethought about how certain religions are privileged in the way that religious freedom is defined here. And then another student wrote about gender dynamics.
So continuing our discussion about religious freedom, you are doing a big religious freedom project right now at the United States Institute for Peace, USIP. Could you first introduce to us what USIP is, and then tell us a little bit about your work on religious freedom, and if it's continuing in the veins of your students, and trying to broaden the conversation about what that might entail?
It was a really serendipitous overlap for me. So I started working at the United States Institute of Peace at the beginning of this calendar year, and also was developing the course. And so you're absolutely right. Some of the themes overlapped, because that's what I've been obsessing about for the last few months. So the United States Institute of Peace is a nonpartisan, independent institute that's funded by Congress, that has for over 25 years been trying to promote the idea that a nonviolent world is both possible and practical and good for US global security. And so through policy analysis, through research, and through networking, it tries to facilitate and assist those who are working for a more peaceful world. It was founded in 1984, and I didn't know this when I joined, and it's the most interesting fact I learned in terms of our conversation and those interested in religion. Religion is the oldest thematic program at the United States Institute of Peace. So all the way back in the 80s, the United States Institute of Peace and scholars there were thinking about the role of religion in conflict and peacemaking. And I mentioned that to say that social scientists, more broadly, took a lot longer to catch up, right? It wasn't for at least another decade that this became more common. And so I work on what's they call the Religion Inclusive Societies team there, that does broadly works on both providing support to religious and faith-based communities engaged in peacemaking and development work, and then also drawing awareness to their work for policymakers. So one big project, not related to my project, but another project, is the role of religious peacemakers or religious actors in peacemaking, or in the institutionalization of peace agreements, and the applicability of peace agreements. So that's a really interesting project that has been going on. And then I'm working on, as you mentioned, what's called the Closing the Gap project, which looks at the relationship between religious freedom, political stability, and economic development.
Can you give us a preview of what you're working on, and well, first, how did the project come to be? What did the founders hope to find? And are you finding what they wanted to find, or are you finding your own things to be true?
I'll start with a bit of a teaser, which is we're finding some of what I think people suspected and some of which they didn't. And in that sense, I'm very optimistic about the project. That signals to me a useful project because it just told us what we already knew. That could be useful because it would show it more systematically, but it's nice to challenge our perspectives as well. So the project itself came about as it's a joint project between the United States Institute of Peace and then USAID's Center for Faith and Opportunity Initiatives. Okay. So this is a branch within the United States Agency for International Development. And they're actually the ones funding the project, but they wanted the USIP to administer it so that, because what we're trying to provide in the end at the most fundamental level are policy recommendations for their work. And so they saw the value of having another organization doing the analysis. So it was a bit more independent to start with. And so we work in collaboration with them. The project has an advisory team as well that's helped us frame our questions. And I'll say a little bit more about how we're doing the work, but the advisory team has been really useful in framing our questions and thinking about how to apply it for policymakers. And it's made up of former Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom, Rabbi David Saperstein, Kent Hill at the Religious Freedom Institute, and a former USAID employee, Elizabeth Cassidy, who's at the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom, and Catherine Marshall, who's at the Berkeley Center for Georgetown, has been doing research for decades on the role of religion and development and religious freedom. So the project is broadly, in some sense, our first stage was clearing the stage a little bit. So there's been a lot of interest, I think, as viewers may be aware, in religious freedom, particularly in the US. The most recent example is the Executive Order on International Religious Freedom, which was issued in June and allocates $50 million for USAID and the State Department to advance international religious freedom in its programming. But it's been a growing interest, and it's actually been a priority for administrations going back as far as President Clinton's administration, when the International Religious Freedom Act was passed in 1998. But anyway, so the idea was here, there's an increased interest among policymakers and also a lot of new data that's been collected over the years. This includes the Religion and State Project that Jonathan Fox leads at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, the Pew Research Center, the Varieties of Democracy Project, and others. And so while a number of papers have been published and studies have been conducted on the relationship between broadly religious freedom, peace, and development, they often use different data sets and they look at different aspects or different time periods. And so the first stage was to do a quantitative analysis, sort of a meta-analysis where we looked at the data. We used all of the data sets to look at these broad relationships. And we thought about religious freedom measured in a variety of different ways, and then political stability or peace in a variety of different ways, such as whether there's an armed conflict or the regime duration, so the sort of political stability in the sense of how long has the political regime been in place. And in terms of economic development, GDP growth, or other prosperity indexes. What we did was we ran various statistical models to look at these relationships, but then use the other data sets for robustness checks. And what we tried to do is pull out the most common themes that we're seeing. So what is supported across, what patterns emerge from looking at the data in general, not looking at one specific data set. And then we'll be conducting 4 country profiles over the next few months, in which we try to drill down a little bit, think about the sequencing of that. So all the statistical analysis is correlational. So we're not saying religious freedom causes democracy or democracy causes religious freedom. That's still an open question. And so we'll do these case studies, and then we'll have a dissemination period in November, December, where we more broadly talk about our results. Happy to preview some of the statistical analysis results if that's of interest.
If you can do it for our viewers in an engaging and not overly statistical way, maybe.
Yeah.
I have a more philosophical question,
Sure.
Which is that in the field of religious studies overall, religious freedom is quite a contentious topic, right? There's some
Yeah.
scholars that go so far as to say it's a nonsensical idea, or it's a culture-bound idea, and yet you have all these data sets that can measure it in all these various ways. How does political science overall think about the concept of religious freedom? And then are you a sort of orthodox or heterodox thinker in political science with regard to how you sort of think about religious freedom, either as a concept or something that can be measured or
Yeah.
choose? Yeah.
So now we get to the easy questions.
Yeah. What our viewers really want to listen
Yes.
to.
Yeah. Well, let me say. I'll just briefly say that what we found so far is, and then tell you why you should be skeptical of those findings. I think that's what the question is in some way raising as well. So I won't talk about the statistical models, but I'll just, we found broadly support for the idea that religious freedom and democracy are positively correlated, with a caveat: Western liberal democracies are not necessarily the most religiously free on the indexes we use. And I think that's an important caveat there. Broadly, we see a relationship between religious freedom and political stability. So countries where there are conflicts, there's more religious repression. But here, and I'll preview a little what I mean by religious freedom. There are two types: from government repression or societal discrimination. And so when there are civil wars, you often see more tension between non-state groups. And then we're interestingly not seeing robust support for the idea of religious freedom positively correlated to economic development. And one reason for that could be that when you're looking across all these countries, Middle Eastern countries tend to have a significant amount of GDP and economic growth in recent years, and also have very high levels of religious freedom. But I will say, when you take those out of the analysis, we still don't see this robust. And the other reason for that could be that there's not necessarily a direct relationship. So some scholars like Brian Grimm and others have suggested religious freedom correlates with other positive social goods that then increase economic development. And the third is that maybe there's not a robust relationship at all. So it's a really big question. I think our findings are opening. How do we think about religious freedom, Brad, and measure it, I think is right, the question. So here, let me say how it's done, and then maybe some of the problems with that, and please push back as well, because we're moving into your area of expertise as well, right?
I was just thinking about our earlier discussions of Turkmenistan and Crete, where arguably one of the great religious freedoms is not to be hassled by people that wanted to convert you to their religion, right?
So,
you kind of see educating people about the Jewish religion, about Jewish Moors, as sort of prophylactic against, people trying to convert them. If they know that it's a legitimate thing and a good thing, then, maybe you won't try to convert them.
Right.
Thinking out loud.
Yeah. Yeah, and so this is actually a primary way that quantitative scholars try to think about religious freedom. So broadly, it gets conceptualized as the ability to privately and publicly adhere to one's beliefs and practice one's faith.
Okay.
Now there are, or I should emphasize, or no faith at all. Right. So in the United States, we tend to use this language of religious freedom or international religious freedom, but more internationally, and particularly in Europe, it's far more common to talk about freedom of religion and belief. Okay. And that's an important caveat because because it emphasizes freedom of belief or no belief at all. So that's one thing to mention. Now there are different ways to think about that. So it raises questions about, well, who's doing the repressing? So we're always measuring this quantitatively in terms of the absence of that. So we're not really measuring religious freedom. We're measuring, as you're saying, the number of incidents that prevent you from doing that. So the religious repression or religious discrimination. And so I actually point you to Jonathan Fox's new book, just came out in 2020, Thou Shalt Have No Other Gods Before Me, has a nice breakdown of 7 or 8 different ways that people can define religious freedom or have. But so I've given you sort of the broad conceptualization, and then the operationalization or the measurement part.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
is generally looking at, are governments doing this or are non-state actors? So government repression and societal discrimination. And then within that, you get different ways governments can repress. Usually we're looking at legal ways. So restrictions in the Constitution on which religions count or not. So is there official religions or not? But then also legal restrictions on who can build places of worship. Can you worship publicly? Can you, anyway, a broad list of sort of indicators from there. And then the second bucket would be the societal discrimination. So are non-state actors harassing, destroying places of worship, and, you know, some really awful instances, killing members of minority faith communities. So that's broadly how that's looked at. Both the Religion and State Project and the Pew Research Center tend to look at a whole list of sources to do that. Some of those based on the International Religious Freedom reports from the State Department, but then also publicly available news sources or other sources within the country. But that signals that even here, even if you are okay with that conceptualization, there are measurement challenges, that certain incidents might be easier to observe or publicly commented on than others. But that's broadly what's happening. And then we're looking, you know, how does that vary across countries? And for those measures, we tend to see that the Middle East and North Africa has what we just call the highest levels of religious repression or lowest levels of religious freedom on these measures. And that, interestingly, Latin America stands out, for example, as having particularly low levels of religious repression or high levels of religious freedom. One other trend to mention is that across these different data sets, they all suggest that religious freedom is declining globally and in most regions, and that would include the West, or what we think of as Western democracies. So that's sort of how we try to think about this quantitatively. Mm-hmm. But then the big question you asked, which is, well, is there this thing, religious freedom, that we're capturing, or are we capturing something else? And here I agree with you. I mean, I think underpinning all of these attempts is what do we mean by religion, right? And I think that's where a lot of the critiques, or at least that's how I see it as a social scientist, a lot of the critiques that from religious studies or critical IR theorists have raised this issue, because if we prioritize so a definition of religious freedom necessarily thinks of some groups as religious and some groups as not, right? And so works, you know, scholars like Winnie Sullivan and Talal Assad and Saba Mahmood, and then also Elizabeth Shockman Hurd in the IR sphere, have all raised this question of certain definitions prioritizing certain groups. And that's, I think it's a very important critique to raise, but I don't think it's a terminal point. So here, I don't know if I'm a heterodox scholar or not, but I would just say, you know, it raises the issue of, okay, religion is a socially constructed concept. And I think that's an opportunity. And I try to do this both in my work on religious freedom and my work on religious conflict. If that's the case, well, how do particular political actors in certain contexts or settings understand it? And then how does that shape their political behavior? And so with religious freedom work and international religious freedom work, I think you can make an argument, and I think even some critical IR theorists have made this argument, that there's a general agreement about how these policymakers think about religion. Now, that prioritizes or privileges certain religions over others, for sure. But if there's a general consensus among policymakers about what they're thinking of religion, well, then we can think about how does that skew our data, or what does that allow? And here I think I'm probably a pretty orthodox social scientist to say, well, how does that shape our data, and what questions can we answer then, and what questions can't we answer? And so what I can tell you is about broad trends in religious freedom, but always giving you, again, these side notes, right? So the measures of religious freedom I've talked about generally don't include persecution of atheists or people of non-belief. Mm-hmm. And so we would want to think about how that fits in. They generally don't include persecution against new religious movements, or what might not fit into that bundle of religions thought about as world religions, right? And that's why I mentioned Latin America before. So Latin America, with the data we have, stands out as a particularly free region. But scholars of that region would probably quickly point at, and as you mentioned, the societal tensions. And a colleague that I have who runs something called the Observatory for Religious Freedom in Latin America has been reminding me a lot recently that a lot of times the tensions between organized criminal groups and small religious communities. So there's a lot going on under the surface of our data. So that's some of the ways we think about this. And so, again, I think it comes back to our point of the data can both provide some picture of what's going on, but also raises and points to other questions. And when you don't marry the critical religion perspective to this positivist approach, you can miss that, right? You might just say, religion can't be defined, full stop, or here's what the data say, that's some, that's some uncritical reality. But the truth is, right, it's somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere in
How does that sit with
people.
you?
I think that's right. I think people are always trying their definitions of religion. One of our great scholars, Jonathan Z. Smith, says that religion is a term for academics, scholars of religion to define. And that's true up to a point. But state actors, non-state actors, ordinary people are also making their own definitions of religion up as they go. And that it would seem to me are also inventing their own ideas of freedom as they go along as well.
And then I think because as a political scientist, I'm very interested in what political communities are doing, particularly states. A lot of the work we're doing also raises, one thing we're trying to do, particularly at the programmatic level, is to say to USAID or other development organizations. So if you're thinking about advancing religious freedom, first, sort of what does that mean conceptually and in practice? And then who does that mean you're going to work with? Does it lead you to prioritize certain groups over others? And then are there any unintended consequences to that? So that sometimes, for example, the promotion of democratization, so democracy might be good for religious freedom in terms of our correlational analysis, but democratization might not be. So that period of unrest might be a period in which conflict and societal tensions might be increased. And the other thing is a friend of mine at the University of Vermont, Peter Henne, we've published on how when there are periods of religious conflict, that leads the state to discriminate more after those periods of conflict, and not just against the group that's risen up, but all religions. And so in this sense, context matters, and to also keep in mind that these political actors are reinterpreting and working with ideas of religious freedom. And here I think about the critique that some countries will use religious freedom to actually discriminate. So this has been a claim levied at Russia, for example. So you can have a law that guarantees religious freedom, but then only for particular religions. And so therefore, by default, there's others. And then you can have the flip side, which is that certain governments can actually signal a broader respect for religion. But going back to your point, might signal to non-state actors that, wow, this is everyone has the right to exist. We're not going to prosecute. So, and this is something we're trying to wrestle with the project. So what is the distinction between government repression and societal repression? If there can be a link in some context. So this whole idea of religious freedom is debated. It's something we can work with to understand these broader patterns. I think ultimately we have to, because there are real people being, and this is what I really appreciate from the work I've done in DC, talking to both the international religious freedom advocates and the communities that have suffered. So they constantly reminding us that these academic debates are important, but real people are suffering now. So how can we advance religious freedom to ameliorate that suffering and persecution, while at the same time not making it worse for other communities? And so that's the tension that we're trying to balance in our work, at least.
Well, it seems like
Yeah.
both critical and empirical scholars of religion are important in that conversation, in that mix.
I hope so. I know that when sometimes when we say things like that, now we have upset everyone on all sides. So
Hopefully,
hopefully,
everyone equally in a Bill Maher like gesture.
yeah,
But on that note,
yeah.
hopefully a note of hope. I want to thank you for joining me today with a conversation. Everyone, this is Dr. Jason Klocek. Where can people find you?
So you can find me both at my website, which is just jasonklocek.com, and on Twitter at JAKlocek, and or at my websites at Notre Dame or USIP. Also, just check out the broader work being done at USIP on religion and other thematic issues, and also the great work being done at Ansari. And I think this brings us back to your pluralism comment, which is, it's not just pluralism amongst religious communities, but pluralism amongst scholars that advances these topics that we've been discussing. So thanks for chatting with me today. It's been a pleasure.